Firstly, I would like to thank the Shakespeare in Prisons Conference and the team of wonderful people, Scott, Melinda, and Kurt, and many others, for giving me the opportunity to have a conversation. At the moment, the conversation is going to feel a bit like a monologue. So you're wherever you are when you're viewing this broadcast, will be sitting somewhere, and at the moment, I will be doing the talking. I don't want it to remain like that. What I want to share with you today, I want to offer humbly as a series of reflections or provocations or challenges, depending on what you think might be more useful or productive or apt for your work. So, why will I do that? Because the work that I do in the UK predominantly now sits within a zone of practice which increasingly is called applied theatre. And I think a great deal of the work that Shakespeare in Prison Conference is doing and the artists that make up that conference are delivering on a daily basis would be what I would understand as being applied theatre. So, though I do work within and have worked within the criminal justice system in the UK and in Latin America, latterly in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, I'm here to talk about stuff which is allied to the practice that we do in the context where we do it. And we find ourselves now at another major crossroads. Where I am in the UK, we are experiencing massive repercussions from the pandemic of COVID-19, and our right wing government is demonstrating in lots of ways that it is experiencing what I can say is great deals of challenges in terms of how it performs competence in any of the important issues that are affecting us socially and economically, seemingly triggered by COVID. But perhaps another way of looking at them would be by saying they are actually revealed by COVID. Simultaneous with the medical pandemic, the globe is still feeling the reverberations of the social pandemic, which was reignited by the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others in the US, that brought discussions around the value of Black lives and how much they do or don't matter into a wider consciousness, into a consciousness where not just those bodies that are so massively affected by the oppression that is racism had to contend with its impacts. For the first time in a very long time, Black Lives Matter and the global uprising that followed the crimes I've already mentioned compelled people who held privilege, predominantly white people, to be required to engage with the problem. Now, they engage with the problem intersectionally from a completely different position to the Black people who have been suffering under that oppression for several hundred years. It manifests itself differently around the globe. I've been fortunate enough to be working in the United States over the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the things which strikes me as an academic, as a Black academic, I think it's important that I say that. I don't think with my identity location, I can just say that I'm an academic because I'm not white. So, as I'm already starting to communicate, some of the things that I'm going to talk about today might resonate for you, or they might agitate you, or they might hit very hard and you might find that your heart is beating faster, or that you're angry, or that some other emotional reaction is generated from being exposed to my opinion. Let's be clear here. I'm not talking about fact, but I am going to be talking about supposition and opinion and experience. So you can take from that what you will, but I feel it's incumbent on me to say I'm going to grasp some nettles, as we say in the UK, and name some elephants that are in the room. But back to this COVID. So what's interesting about a global mass infection is it takes no relevance of status. It takes no relevance of gender, sexuality, faith, or ethnicity. It is blind to all of these things and just infects everyone. And in so doing, it is my opinion that it reveals some of the social injustices that people like yourselves and colleagues I know in the UK and in other places working in issues of arts and social justice maybe have been aware of for many, many years. So, in saying that, I'm not intending to uh, create a sermon which is preaching to the converted. But if it is a point of view where you feel there is synergy with your own work and you can feel that you might understand where I'm coming from, starting by saying that I'm a black academic rather than just an academic, then maybe the conversation that starts here will be of benefit to you. The revelations that sat behind COVID as a pandemic brought into stark contrast for us in the UK structural inequalities that we had been aware of but not speaking about for hundreds of years. As I said previously, my experience of working in the United States means that there seems to be a more honorable relationship with the colonial and imperial past that implicated and helped create the country that we now understand to be the United States. How united they are is probably open to discussion right now, but I was refreshed when I came as a delegate or speaker to conferences in the United States that often at the beginning of those conferences, the hosts, the moderators would make reference to our ancestors, our collective ancestors, and remind us that we did not own the land that we are standing on or sitting talking from, and that the bloodshed and the lives of many created situations that we benefited from in various ways, and that we should be mindful of this. Now, again, possibly for a number of North American viewers of this, that might not seem so surprising. That might seem as being only right and proper, only correct. And I would agree. But I would give you this observation. In the UK, were you to invoke that kind of sentiment at the beginning of a professional academic conference, even one that was talking about arts and social justice, many of the British colleagues sitting in the audience or on the panel beside you would squirm in their seats, would be uncomfortable or confused and look at you quizzically as to why you were talking about these things. One of the things that struck me then was that in the United States, there seems to be, in certain circles, a different veneration of their complicity in a post-colonial past. Now, post-coloniality is not only hard to say, but it's also an interesting area where confusion can arise. What does it mean to be post-colonial? Does it mean that you are free and independent, or does it simply mean that those people who used to dominate and oppress you are no longer physically or materially in power? Because can you genuinely say that uh, an area is post-colonial if it still functions primarily in the majority of the ways in which the colonists, when they invaded and conquered the land, functioned? If it still adheres to their systems, their values, their laws, is it really not still just colonized? And why is that relevant to us in the work that we do? Well, mainly because we can see the impact of that colonial residue, as I like to call it, with and on the people we work with. It's no coincidence that in both the US and the UK, if you look at the demography of the male and female prison populations, certain identities who may sit in the mathematical minority in the rest of society are massively overrepresented. I won't go into statistics because I believe that the people I'm speaking with here probably know that already. Why are there so many African Americans in the prison system? Why are there so many Black Britons in the prison system? And ultimately, I can say I think I know why. Because the system, power, has over two, three, 400 years aligned itself around structures that mean not that those bodies are marginalized, though they are, but that those bodies are systematically excluded, systematically denied opportunities and privileges that power, primarily white power, has reserved for itself. Again, it would be my supposition that the people I'm speaking to now through this presentation at this conference know that already. So why am I reiterating it? I think I'm reiterating it because, like the number of fatalities that have been recorded as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is again no coincidence that there is an over-representation of bodies that are normally considered to be minorities in society. And I'm curious and infuriated by what I see as the discourse around those seemingly self-evident pieces of information which are presented in these straitened times that we find ourselves as being revelations. In the UK, I've watched many right-wing politicians squirm and dissemble around information about why is it that so many black people and people of color and brown people have died during the COVID pandemic? Why is it that there are so many black people and brown people and people of color, sometimes annoyingly designated as black and minority ethnic? BAME. Let's be clear, BAME is not a word. BAME is an acronym. Don't call me BAME because you're not calling me anything. But I digress. Why is it that so many of these bodies are being overrepresented in these places? And we know it's called racism. It's not rocket science. Though some black people were involved in a lot of rocket science, but it didn't come to be clear until quite late. It's racism. Again, I would surmise that the people to which I'm talking to today will be aware of this. But what I think the joint pandemics of COVID-19 and brutal state supported murder, to talk about it in its extremis, have brought back to the consciousness is that being aware that there is structures of oppression, and let's be clear, in this moment, I'm talking about structures of oppression that sit around an ethnic identity. I'm fully aware that there are multiple intersections of oppression that constellate themselves around the idea of ethnic oppression, racism. I'm very aware of that. I'm aware that as a male identifying body, I have privilege in one of the other oppressive technologies, that technology of patriarchy. I'm aware of that. But for this beginning, opening salvo of a conversation today, I wanted to think about ethnic identities. Because again, it would be my surmise that working in the work that we do as practitioners, and it's interesting thinking about the work that we do, not just the theory, the work that we do, that a lot of the populations we work with, I've already spoken about. So why am I banging on about it? I'm banging on about it, I believe, because this is potentially us coming to an intersection, as you would call it in the US, a crossroads. There is a moment now where those practices that have at the core of their values ideas of equity and inclusion and social justice need to, in my opinion, look to themselves. I'm very fortunate in the UK. I am titled as Dr Sylvan Baker. I use that PhD experience to validate my role in some sense as a lecturer, an academic in applied theatre, the practice I talked about at the beginning of this talk. So seemingly my location, my position in this process would be as an activist, an artist and an activist, and a researcher and a teacher. One of the good guys, yeah? But the point that I'm wanting to begin to make with you today is most of the time, those people who are villainous also think that they're the good guys. And if we are the good people, not the good guys, the good people, if we are those people, we have to embrace the fact that some of the structures that we work within and some of the work that we may do may be perpetuating injustices that we don't agree with. I find myself as a practitioner that works using art to collaborate with communities, and those communities vary from geographic groups to communities of interest to communities of identity or communities of age. I find myself currently in a turn towards decolonization, equity, and inclusion. That's a good thing, but it's sometimes slightly worrying that words like we need to decolonize the curriculum, we need to decolonize, we need to decolonize, that the word is said so often now that it verges on being pejorative. It verges on losing its meaning. What does it mean? Well, for me, I think it means that we need to be aware that the educational structures, the social structures, The structures that allow the economic structures are all based on the blood that was spilt during global empire building and conquest, and most notably for people of my identity location, from the transatlantic slave trade, from enslavement. So even something as august as the national poet that is William Shakespeare in the UK has been made into a tool for the assimilation and oppression of others. So if that's something that we are unhappy with, then the provocation that I'm wanting to invite you to consider today is, okay, irrespective of my ethnic identity position, if I'm against oppression, and in this case, if I'm against the oppression which is racism, what am I going to do? Now, I'm being really clear. What am I going to do? Not what are black and brown people going to do. They've been doing it for an awfully long time now, with varying degrees of success and failure, and at some great cost. What I'm talking about here is to all those practitioners who work with those black and brown bodies, African American, British, Black British, and others, to look at the roots of their practice. Suddenly, we are in a terrifying moment where the proximity of the oppressions that we are experiencing around health and wealth and well-being and criminal justice and general engagement with the higher privileges of society are so visible that we have to see what we can do as a coalition of those who care about social justice. In my own institution, there has been a depressing narrative of um, ineffective, incompetent decision making, which has meant that the experiences and lives of students of color and staff of color have been made more challenging and difficult, sometimes downright horrible. That's known. And I think it's known that the majority of the academic staff in mine and many institutions around the UK believe this to be wrong and want to do something about it. But what? How do we decolonize? Is it simply just a case of changing the names and the ethnic identity of the scholars who we cite, or the authors of the books that we put on our bibliographies, so that the students are invited to engage with knowledge that comes from different bodies? Is that enough? I'd say it's a start. I think that we have to sit down, sit still, and look very hard at ourselves. And let's be clear, I definitely include myself in this cohort, even though I'm a black-bodied academic and practitioner. Somehow or other, I have managed to get through and over lots of those exclusive barriers that stop others with bodies like mine being in the academy. So I have to accept that in some shape or form, if there are oppressive structures, even though I might be an inside outsider, as some may say, I'm also more than likely tainted by the same oppressive structures. Am I a collaborator? Am I a sellout? Am I a token? It might be for others to judge. I would say that my practice in the academy operates in the same way as it did when my practice was in the community, in an insurgent way. It's a word which, after current discourses around global conflicts and wars on, may have lost its currency, but for the confines of my conversation today, I want to reclaim it. As practitioners, we are insurgent almost all of the time, by definition, because we are working in an environment and working around rules that we never decided, that we never set. We are guerrilla, punk, underground, undercover, a lot of the time. Yes, we might put our head up above the ground every now and then and be conventional, but we are in systems that maybe we are trying to inoculate with other ways of being. And that's what brings me back to sitting down and looking oneself in the face and asking oneself, what does decolonizing, opening up, making more inclusive look like? Because it sounds fine, but what does it look like? And I would argue that it looks like change. It looks like upset. It looks like confusion. The scholar Sarah Ahmed mentions that for some who have privilege, equity and inclusion starts to look like oppression. I think it's a really clear and beautiful statement, because what it's talking about is, what does power have to give up to allow, to usher into, this is knowing that power never ushers in change, change is made on power. But what does power have to give up so that any kind of social justice could become a reality? And what does it feel like? Well, for power, it feels like oppression. So we're sitting down, we're looking at the fundamental components of our practice. Because I think if we want to decolonize, if we want to open up, if we want to make our practices more inclusive, and possibly begin to change the demography of those who are working alongside us in arts and social justice, we need to go back to the foundation, back to the core. In the UK, in applied theatre, I was struck as an emerging practitioner many, many, many years ago by the fact that the cohorts, the groups, the participants that I worked with were fairly, the word was diverse in those days, were fairly mixed in terms of their needs, their identities, their ethnicities, their genders, their sexuality. However, the practitioners that were working with those groups were almost exclusively white and predominantly female, middle class. The applied theatre sector is massively populated with white middle class women. Now, to be clear, I have nothing against white middle class women. Why shouldn't they want to work in this sector? But I do have questions about what it must be like for the participants who are not white middle class women to have those white middle class women working with them. What does it say? What does it covertly reinforce in terms of their identity or social situations about who they are and what they are entitled to be? And I think it's that which is making me want to consider and ask the difficult questions about how we fundamentally change what we do. As practitioners or artists that pursue and follow a craft, there comes into being, once the process starts to become codified, things that become known as canon, core, essential. But if we look at those things around the practices that we do in arts and social justice, how many of them are equitable? How many of them are inspired by the same bodies that are also complicit in the oppression of the people that we want to work with? For this conversation, I've already mentioned one of them, Shakespeare. How often has Shakespeare been used as the balancing factor of greatness, as the the yardstick of what is culture, and in so doing, erased the rich, fluent, and textured beauty of indigenous cultures as white British colonists traveled the world and conquered it in the name of their regent or their monarch. In the UK, they used to say, and they now sing in certain songs, that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And sadly, some of the cultural exports that come from that empire, come from that mother country, include Shakespeare. Many times, Shakespeare has been used to calm the savage classes of the lands that have been conquered and were crying out for civilization. Again, something we know. But actually, what does that mean? What it means to me is I have to think about everything that I do in my practice so that I can start to consider its implications on the people I am practicing with. And that might be one of the first things to think about. Take a moment and audit what your relationship is to the participants that you work with. Are they the material that you use as inspiration to create the art that works with them? Are they the art? Or are they, as I believe is the way forward, the artists working alongside you as an artist, making the work? What do I mean? I mean, do they collaborate with you or are they led by you? In my work across the UK and globally, at the center of the practice is the idea that the people whose environment I'm in are not the subject of whatever practice or research I'm doing. They are the experts. They are the co-researchers on that practice. Only then can I begin to start the long transaction of giving them ownership, power, and access to the agency that they have. The available agency, I call it. The agency which systems and structures and truisms, truisms being those things that are repeated so often that they are then taken as fact, rob many people of. We all have some kind of agency, but often, sometimes by being designated as excluded or marginalized or oppressed, we are automatically taking that agency away. And in bringing our knowledge and our expertise and our desire to want to raise the consciousness of the communities that we work with, there is a risk, not a necessity, not an inevitability, but a risk that we might be taking away some of the structures and social capital from those groups by only reinforcing that they are excluded or marginalized. So for me, one of the core changes in how arts and social justice can function in any environment, and particularly within a criminal justice environment, is to reset its relationship to the people who it's working with. Yes, they may be in closed settings. Yes, they may be designated as criminals. But that doesn't mean that we cannot find some way to work alongside them. Being fully aware and transparent that if they are in a closed setting, at the end of the project, we can leave that setting and they cannot. Only then are we starting to set up transactions with them which are based around a reality that they can understand. We are not coming to endow them with our art. to open their eyes to things that artists can see, but they cannot. Because if we are doing that, we are re-performing the oppressions that have brought them, in some cases, into those environments. So I'm back to that core moment, sitting in front of the mirror, asking myself, and therefore asking you, what we should do. I recorded a TED talk for a TEDx event that was held at my university. And the title of that event talk was Simple Questions with Really Complicated Answers. And I called it that because the question I was asking was, why is the academy not at all representative ethnically of the society in which it finds itself? And we kind of know the answer. I've already mentioned that at the beginning of this talk. We're fully aware that the pandemics that we're experiencing at the moment have revealed the extent again of the structural oppression that's in place in most of our major institutions and definitely in education. So at the core of my TED talk was this question that was naive and basic. If we know the problem and we see the problem, why can't we fix the problem? And it was at that point, whenever the problem was posed as the simple question, individuals I had posed it to would say, oh, well, it's a very, very complex question. Now, I don't want to be reductive and say that some of the challenges around uh, removing oppression are not complex and are not multifactored and are not in um, flexible and evolving relationship with each other. I for one believe that we live in a post-modern period of history. Pre-postmodern times, there was a problem. And if there was a problem, there was a solution. And once you applied the solution to the problem disappeared. Living in post-normal times, not postmodern times, apologies, post-normal times means that there is a problem that is constantly changing and adding in complexity. And actually fixing one facet of that problem in one area destabilizes and re-problematizes a different facet of that problem in another area. We have a pandemic, therefore we need protection, PPE in the UK. But we can't get the PPE because the people who produce that PPE live outside the UK. And we've just decided that we're going to change our relationship to those people who live outside the UK whom we trade with. Just a small section of a massive post-normal problem. It matters to us because as the artists that we want to be, working in the areas that I hope we want to work in, we don't want to add to those post-normal problems. So I come back to this question, what are we going to do? Well, as I said, initially for me, one of the things that I think we should do is consider who and how we work with the people who are around us, who we've been calling participants. The next is to open ourselves to the realization and acceptance that we may be fighting for the solution, but we also may be wittingly and unwittingly part of the problem. We may be selling out a bill of goods, standing on a theoretical position which already in its operation excludes. I have an esteemed colleague who is very prominent in voice coaching as a component of actor training and very, very successful at it. And he took the courage to look at his efficacy as a teacher and see that, yes, he was hitting 70 to 80% of his students, but what was he doing or not doing that was missing the remaining 20 to 30%? And that's actually quite a hard question to ask oneself. If I'm ostensibly doing really well and I'm really effective, why should I ask myself, what's wrong with the 30%? Why are they not getting what I'm saying? Arguably, that's looking at the question the wrong way up. What am I doing not as well as I could do, or even wrongly, which is cutting that 20 to 30% out of the achievement of their own success? That was the beginning position for his research and is the beginning question I offer to you. Okay, I have changed the way I look at and the transactions I set up around the people I work with as participants. I have accepted that in acting in some ways without being in a position where I can be fully anti-oppressive, I may be part of the problem. And now I'm being asked to look at the percentage, the small percentage of people who are not benefiting from my intervention when the vast majority are benefiting from it. Oh, that's hard. That's very hard, but it's necessary. So what do I mean when I say the very practice that we apply may already be oppressing? Let me give you a different example. Um, there is a wonderful artist and leader of a disabled arts organization called Jenny Seeley. She came to fame as the creator and creative director of the 2012 Paralympic opening and closing ceremonies. A great director and actor and artist who is also deaf. And she, on many times, on many occasions, had mentioned that at its core, actor training, in this example, though it's not the only discipline, actor training automatically excludes those with various kinds of disability from the very beginning. If we go back to my colleague who is a voice trainer, he had to realize and contend with the fact that one of the first things he would do as a voice trainer is say, stand in neutral, balance yourself so that your weight is equally distributed between your feet and that you're standing with your spine, with each vertebrae in connection to the next one. That's where we start. That's neutral. That's the beginning of our practice that will allow us to produce voice in the most effective and productive way. What Jenny Seeley said about and observed about that core or foundational idea of voice management and production is that what does that mean if you are an aspiring actor who doesn't have 2 feet or cannot stand? Does that mean that you can't produce voice effectively and productively? Or, as I would tend to agree, does it mean that the foundational practices that are being offered to you automatically exclude you? So, when you sit and make the audits of the practice that you do, consider those whom, for whatever reasons, may not get it. The light bulb may not come on above their heads during the work that you do with them, or afterwards when you meet them in other settings and they say, I used to work with you and you, well, I forgot what we did. Why might that be? And it's a hard question to ask. It's hard to come face to face with the prospect that even though we may have been practicing for nigh on 30 years or more, as I have, we may have to face the reality that we may have been practicing badly or even wrongly. So, to reiterate, I believe that we have to go back to our core principles and that we have to look at what builds those core principles and makes them canon. Should there be a canon? And if there should be a canon, should it be more diverse? What should we be teaching from global performance that sits alongside Shakespeare, that demonstrates different understandings and celebrations of cultural achievement, intellect, genius, words that are often thrown around about the bard Shakespeare? Is that enough? If we put those in, are we making our curriculums, are we making our practice inclusive, anti-racist, decolonial? I would contend possibly not. We have to look back and continue to look back, because this is not a transactional process. This is not, oh yeah, I thought about it and now I've done anti-racism so I can move on to something else. We should remember something which focuses my mind on a daily basis. Never underestimate the recuperative power of power. What? What do I mean? I mean that power in itself has always functioned like a viral antigen. It evolves, it adjusts to head off any kind of interventions that challenge it. In the UK, after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, there was a public uprising. Even though there was a pandemic, even though there was a risk of infection, many people, both black and white, took to the streets to record their dissent with the idea that black lives didn't matter. People took the knee. People still are taking the knee. People stood up and were counted. And then in a large city in the, what would it be, south west of the country called Bristol, which is almost fundamentally a beneficiary as a port of the transatlantic slave trade. In Bristol, there was a statue venerating a Victorian slaver. And in their anger and frustration, this statue was torn down and thrown into the river, into the Bristol Channel. At that point, power saw its opportunity. It was able to wrestle the dialogue away from Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, away from actual lives and onto statues. Should we change the statues? Roads must fall. Should we take them down? Should we replace them? I'm not saying that this isn't an interesting and productive conversation, and in the wider scheme of things, not only that, but a part of trying to be more anti-racist. But is it the center of the conversation as it became in the UK? Within days, there was a barricade around the venerated statue of Sir Winston Churchill because it had been revealed that within his life he had acted in ways that were racist. Suddenly, there were white supremacists taking to the streets to protect our heritage. I say our in the biggest of quotes. Suddenly, the discourse was not about lives, it was about bronze. And in that shift of focus, some of its impact began to peter out. So, yeah, people are still talking about Black lives and whether they matter, but they're also still talking about statues, which at this point of the argument are irrelevant. Black lives matter, Black people matter, not statues. But power has managed to mutate, use its knowledge and networks of the institutions to shift the argument. So, how often does that happen in our field? The question I asked about why are there not very many Black academics in the academy? And the answer I received was, well, it's because it's really hard to find. It's not really hard to find. The number of Black undergraduates in the UK is going up. But what isn't going up is the number of those undergraduates that move on to do postgraduate research. Okay, more do MAs, but an increasing number of them stop studying at MFA or PhD level. Why is that? We know why. Because we know that the academic system is already slanted against them. So what that means is we feel comfortable in saying we would love to have a much more diverse faculty. We would love to have a much more diverse practitioner grouping coming to our conferences, but we just can't find them, inferring that they are already self-selecting out of the process. No, they're not self-selecting out of the process. We are continuing to allow them to be excluded by not drawing attention to the structures that have already knocked them out of the pipeline before they get to that stage. Yes, there's benefit in making sure that doctoral research and MFA research programs are inclusive and have looked at their curriculum and have looked at how they teach their curriculum and have looked at who teaches the curriculum. But by then, we're already 50 to 70% too late. Because if, like myself, you were fortunate enough to get to the postgraduate program, you've already gotten over the barriers and challenges. We need to be looking further back up the pipeline. So although I might be jumping around in my discourse, it still should come back to this point. The point being, what are we going to do and how? So I've talked about collaboration. I've talked about looking at the key, core, fundamental facets of our practice to audit how oppressive it is, because it will be in some shape or form. Why is it that there are so many white middle-class women in British applied theatre? And what does that say to the participants, as I've said before? What I'm not necessarily saying is, well, those white middle-class women are not allowed to work in applied theatre. But I am making the offer to them and others to be differently mindful of their, not just their privilege, but their positionality on this. What does it say to their participants if they make explicit that, yes, I'm working with you, and have you noticed that I'm not of the same ethnic identity as you? And that's the thing, isn't it? Maybe that changes the discourse, the dialogue, the reflection. How can you open yourself up to the feedback from your participants for whom your interventions are not successful? What do you do with the discomfiture that may come with it? And yes, it's okay to look at what I'm saying and going like, that boy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. What's going on? He's just blathering. He's just angry. I am angry. I don't know whether I'm just blathering. What was it James Baldwin said? To be a black man in these days is to always be angry. And I think he was probably right, and still probably right. So when I sit and I see, or when I'm up and I'm working, and I'm aware that I'm the only black person in the room, I'm the only black academic at the conference, I'm the only black academic in the faculty board, I'm the only black academic who has tenure, I'm angry. If we mean change and we want change, we first have to change. And sometimes for those who have privilege, and I have privilege, I'm very aware of it, there is the extra fragility, nervousness, resistance, diffidence that says, yes, I want to do something, but I'm not experiencing the oppression. So I don't want to speak for those that are oppressed. Good. But let me reiterate again, those who are experiencing the oppression 24/7, 365 are already doing something. And the labor of doing that is breaking them. So I'm insisting that you consider working alongside them. But a word about that allyship. Allyship is a conditional verb. I give you my allyship. I turn my social media square on Black Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, whatever day it was, in support of Black Lives Matter. And then 3 weeks later, I turn it back to kittens. I withdraw my allyship. I think if you genuinely care about the process, maybe the more productive place to locate yourself is with some skin in the game. Don't be an ally, be an insurgent, be an accomplice, be a guerrilla amongst and alongside other guerrillas who have to be in that position for survival. I mentioned that there were multiple pandemics in action currently because survival is not an overstatement. If you don't know how to get yourself into a position of even allyship, then if you are sitting in a position of privilege, do the work, do the research. And the research is not going up to somebody who's feeling the oppression and saying, how do I do this? The work is reading, experimenting, rehearsing, devising, and finding the answers. There's a reason why the author Renee Lodge stopped talking to white people about race. It's because she was tired, because she was exhausted. Yeah? Because she felt that she was having the same conversations over and over and over again. So, as I say, those of us who want to be and are art activists around social justice, we need to look to ourselves. I don't say that to demotivate us. I say that to re-motivate us. If we want to be sure of how we do what we do, if we want to open the doors to more people from different identity locations to do it with us, then we need to be acting as accomplices to each other. In this patriarchal society, which I benefit from, even though I hate, I need to become an accomplice with my female identifying colleagues. I don't need to speak for them, but I need to understand what's going on to the best of my ability, because some things will not be legible. But that's not me asking them to explain to me what it's like to be a woman. It's not that. It's me standing shoulder to shoulder with them when they experience the oppression that is sexism, in the same way that they will stand shoulder to shoulder with me when I experience the oppression that is racism. It's simple. The questions are simple. The answers, I believe, are simple. There needs to be a revolution. I think it's Edward Said that said, we only need to change one thing, and that one thing is everything. So when you talk about it in those terms, sometimes that can become a disempowering proposition. I can't change it. You've just told me that it's post-normal, that it evolves, that it's like a virus in and of itself, power. How can I change that? I would say, grasp the available agency that you have. Do everything that was within your power to make sure that you are skilled up around the mechanics of oppression. It might be changing the font of the information pamphlets that you create from a serif font like Times Roman to a non-serif font like Calabri, and then printing everything out at font size 12 so that those of us who are dyslexic can read it more easily. Investing in buff colored paper, beige, so that we can read it more easily. And you might discover that in doing that, in making your print more inclusive, everybody benefits, not just those people who are neurodivergent. It might be insisting that The site where you deliver your intervention, your workshop, your project is fully accessible. And turning down the room which is on the first or second floor, depending where you are in the world, that is only accessible by stairs. It might be about looking at your core practice and saying, is it racist? Is it sexist? Is it homophobic? Is it oppressive in any other way? And if it is, stop using it. That can be hard. My colleague who is a voice coach, they learn something which is called standard English. In Britain, we call it received pronunciation. Talking poshly, sounding like you're in the royal family. But part of the colonial residue of that particular accent is it is the accent of conquest. It is the lingua franca in the lingua franca of English being English. So when you teach an actor who is a descendant of a community that was subject to invasion and conquest, you erase an aspect of their identity. Unless, while you're teaching that standard English, you are also sharing the information that in some contexts, still, that accent is the accent of empire. So, I want to thank again the Shakespeare in Prisons Conference for giving me the opportunity to ask you some questions and to publicly ask myself some questions. I'm even asking those questions of Shakespeare itself. Much as I love many of the plays that are in the canon, we've spoken about canons. So the question that I want to finish with, which is the question I've been posing to you since the beginning of this talk, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time for staying with it, if you're still with it, is what are you going to do? And how are you going to do it? And how are you going to use the available agency that you have to make change? Because you can. It might be small, but when you collect all of that smallness up, it becomes a paradigm shift, a new way of being, a new normal, or as I like to think about it, a new post normal. Thank you very much.